for democratic backsliding and the rule deals mean for the political, economic, and social futures of the Americas. We are delighted to have with us today a wonderful panel of speakers who will take on these crucial questions. I will introduce each speaker only briefly, but more information is available on the class and the Georgetown Americas Institute website. So Dr. Azul America Aguiar Aguilar is a full-time professor of political science at ITESO, the Jesuit University of Guadalajara, and a lecturer at the University of Guadalajara in Mexico. Her work examines comparative judicial politics and democratization processes in Mexico and Latin America. Dr. Fernando Bizarro is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Boston College. His research in comparative politics and political economy explores the nature, the causes, and the consequences of democracy and political parties with a substantive focus on Latin America. Dr. Claudio Fuentes, ahí al final, is a full professor at the at the School of Political Science at Diego Portales University in Santiago de Chile. His research agenda has focused on understanding the socio-political dynamics of institutional change, including the use of force in democratic contexts, constitutional reforms, and the legal status of indigenous people. And David Landau holds the Tobias Simon Eminent Scholar Chair at Florida State University College of Law, and also serves as the College of Law's Associate Dean for International Programs. His scholarship focuses on constitutional design, constitutional theory, and comparative constitutional law. And our moderator today is Michael Shifter, right in the middle, who is an adjunct professor in the Center for Latin American Studies here at Georgetown, and who formerly served as the president of the Inter-American Dialogue. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you very much, Diana, and good afternoon to everybody. Buenas tardes, and it's great to be here, and it's great to, it's a great pleasure to moderate this session with four really first-rate analysts and professors who have done so much work in thinking about democratic backsliding, which is kind of the topic of the day when everybody talks about the region. So I'm sure they're going to shed a lot of light on what's going on. So just to get started, sort of the opening question, and we'll start with perhaps Azul, is to talk a little bit about what are, and you could pick any country you like, Mexico, Brazil. I mean, unfortunately, we have lots of countries to choose from. We have a large sample here when it comes to democratic backsliding in the Americas. So, but maybe just kind of give us a sense of what you see as sort of the most identifiable kind of elements of democratic backsliding in any particular country, maybe Mexico. We can start with that and then move on to other countries. But why don't we start with Azul for a few thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you. There? No, it's working. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, what I have identified when I was looking to the cases in Latin America, but also other regions of the world, like for instance, Eastern Europe, and there are some special, very common steps that autocrats or elected leaders with autocratic tendencies conduct when they get to power. And one of them has to be with undermining the legitimacy of institutions, institutions that oversize them or overlook on them, control them, and check on their power. So this is a very characteristic. And when they notice that these institutions are controlling them in several ways, like for instance, transparenting information about their governments, striking down decisions they take to advance their policies, their projects. Then the second step they start developing is attacks, direct attacks on these institutions, particularly rhetorical attacks. These attacks had happened not only in Mexico or in El Salvador when then the court struck down the decision of providing Bukele with money for security purposes, but also in Brazil when Bolsonaro didn't get what he wanted from the court, or he saw the court was prosecuting his most closer allies, then he started criticizing the courts and using it to polarize society. And this is very dangerous because the judiciary is one of the institutions, for instance, that is not very well known among the public. So it is easy to target the judiciary because the judiciary are the justice system for the normal people outside, the system from the police until the prosecutor and then the judge, right? So these three institutions are very different and they have different institutional arrangements that make them dependent sometimes. So they attack, but sometimes attacks, one of my professors told me, well, Azul attacks here are not like undermining democracy. You cannot say like this is a characteristic of democratic backsliding. And I said, yeah, that's true. An attack cannot undermine democracy, but prepares the path to undermine it through institutional reforms. So what I have saw also is that they start to conduct institutional reforms that undermine legally using their majorities or using their captured courts that undermine the democratic rules of the game. For instance, the case of Bukele. Once he was elected, his party won a majority in the Congress in 2021. The first move he made was to dismantle the constitutional court and the prosecutor, name their loyals, and then ask the court for re-election, even when it was constitutionally prohibited, as you know. So this is important because they have learned that they have to move, they had to introduce this move as soon as they got their majorities. And that's what Orban did, that's what Erdogan did, and that's what AMLO also did once they got their majorities in the chambers. So I will stop here because I don't want to expand, but I'll be happy to continue.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I'm sure we'll follow up, but why don't we turn to Fernando and see how you see things?
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me. I tend to think of political regimes as things that vary along two dimensions, right? They vary on the ways in which power is allocated and the ways in which power is exercised. You have democracies are regimes that combine high scores on both dimensions. So democracies are regimes in which power is allocated through extensive participation and competition and exercised within very clear constitutional limits. That's what I think of a democracy. And what I think is interesting about cases of recent democratic backsliding is that what we've seen is that political actors are weaponizing one dimension of democracy, which is the kind of electoral or popular dimension of democracy, to undermine the other dimension of democracy, which is the exercise of power and the limits on the exercise of power. And so when I think about cases of democratic backsliding in recent years, and that's what I think is so different about them in terms of their comparison to previous waves of autocratization around the world, and certainly in Latin America, is that in the second wave of autocratization, at least, the one in the 1940s and 1960s, or in the 1960s and 1970s, what you had was a concerted attacks to both dimensions of democracy. And what you have now is that actors are using the majoritarian component of democracy to erode the liberal component of democracy, or using the majoritarian, participatory, competitive dimension of democracy to erode limits on power. And that's where most of the backsliding we have seen so far has happened. The cases in which backsliding was the most severe were the cases in which this initial attack was successful to the point in which then leaders could turn back and take advantage of the fact that they had eroded controls on their power to erode back the participatory dimension of democracy. And that's how you end up in the Venezuelan case. That's how you end up in the more extreme case of backsliding, in which you don't have only backsliding, you have democratic breakdown, right? And so you have the backsliding, generally the backsliding we have seen is an erosion in the controls of power dimension of democracy. And sometimes leaders are able to capitalize on that erosion to then destroy the other dimension of democracy and destroy democracy as a whole.
Great. Thank you. Why don't we go to Claudio and then we'll go to David. Claudio, how do you see it?
Yeah.
There you go. There you go.
There you are.
Yeah.
Thank you for the invitation to be here. I could say that there are like some signs of the erosion of democracy or democratic backsliding that are very different. And in the Chilean case, I think that is a case of very institutionalized democratic system, but have been some signs that are social and political. Politically, first, I think that the first sign is when traditional institutions that are set to comply with certain rules are being used for other reasons or for other purposes. For instance, the armed forces that start being used to control internal affairs. Second, the empowerment of presidential powers in terms of like the relationship between the different powers within the democratic system. So basically, we are going back to the debate in not only in Chile about governing by decree. And I think that you know about this here. So governing by decree is becoming a solution to this crisis. So weakening the role of the Congress, the checks and balances, and all this debate about institutions. But there are like another social dimension, which I would like to address, which is related to whether society respect the rules, basically, and respect the norms, the social norms of behavior. And I think that we also are observing this tendency. To give you an example, 70% of the population in Chile today favor that the police have not to complain with the rules in order to trap delinquents, for instance. And all the public opinion are very kind of mano dura, hard fist, kind of in terms of not complying with the human rights or rules or basic rule of behavior of the police or the judges in order to achieve certain social orders. So I think that the weakening is not only about the changing the institution, but also at the social level on how socially you are being affected by these new conditions, and that is impacting the social life. So there is like a slow degradation of institutions socially and politically. I will stop there.
Fantastic. David?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of puzzles at this moment for me. One of which is whether sort of what's going on is new or old. And the other of whether it's kind of country specific or regionally specific or global in nature. And I think all of those questions are surprisingly hard to answer, right? I think at one level, it really does kind of look global. Democracy is endangered in big parts of the world. And you have a type of figure that comes to power, gets elected, and it's use the term populist, right? Who then has kind of authoritarian tendencies. So what is paradigmatic of the moment, but not exactly new, right, is the use of law instead of military force, right, to kind of degrade or erode democracy. And the use of the forms of liberal democratic constitutionalism, usually. So like there aren't, if you think about Latin America, I mean, there aren't overt challenges to sort of the form of a certain kind of constitutionalism. The idea is we're going to use that form to achieve what we want to achieve. What is depressing, I think, when you see it is how easily in a number of places those institutions, norms, the whole structure of liberal democratic constitutionalism can be turned against itself, right? With, I think, surprising ease. And so you would say, well, is it, do we take any comfort from the fact that law is now being used instead of a military coup? And I think the answer, and it is kind of interesting, right, is no, right? Well, maybe we do take some, but not much, in the sense that, in some sense, I think it's harder to deal with legal change of this type, both domestically and internationally, I don't think, for example, the international community has fully caught up or grappled with the implications of the fact that, you can capture a constitutional court and then that court can do enormous damage to the democratic order instead of propping it up. And at the level of constitutional design, we're basically nowhere in terms of figuring out how to respond to these kinds of challenges. It's maybe a little strong, right? But we really haven't figured it out as well. So I don't think it is completely new. And populism is old in Latin America. We know that. The use of law to degrade democracy is not wholly new. But the scope of the phenomenon of sweep across a number of different countries globally is something we haven't caught up with how to deal with, I think, at the level of either constitutional design or just kind of international, sort of international institutions as well.
Great, thank you. I want to follow up with all of you by asking if you could comment on the idea, which we hear all the time, that the problem is democracies haven't delivered. Democracies haven't performed, and we're in the situation that all of you have described very clearly in Latin America, and whether it's Mexico, Brazil, El Salvador, Chile, that basically, crime is worse than ever. Inequality really hasn't been addressed. There's just, huge problems. And so bad performance has created conditions that have given rise to these reactions or not. Or alternatively, whether you could say, well, democracies have performed, reasonably well, but we just have, autocratic leaders that are spreading and that seem to be able to get away with it. And so it's not that democracies aren't performing, it's just that we have a different kind of leadership that is kind of taking hold. And I was wondering if you can comment on that debate. Azul?
That's a very interesting question. I think democracies have delivered, right? And different to adding, not different, but adding to what you say that we have new autocrats, what I believe we have failed is to, again, communicate what democracies are. And this is something very important because people, not normal people, not people that get into university and study theories of democracy, knows that democracy is related to something really else than elections. For them, elections are okay, but participation, justice, equality are the three words, for instance, that social leaders in Latin America told us are the definitions they give to democracy in a survey we conducted with different Jesuit universities in Latin America. So that's what's very striking because none of our democracies is delivering participatory mechanisms to include more people in the decision-making process. No democracies in Latin America are more equal than before. And justice systems are just broken. I mean, apart from courts, prosecutors, public defender, prison systems, police institutions are, in very bad and worse condition. I will say very similar as they were in our authoritarian past. No, they haven't changed that much. Especially, in some countries they might. For instance, the police in Chile might have changed, or also the prosecutors, but you will tell us better there. And I think this is a problem because, we haven't communicated to the people that that democracies and other impacts in other institutions of democracy cannot be conducted if we do not have the chance to have elections, right? And this is something that has struck me from this study because, we have also autocratic leaders that are using these problems, but I also believe we need a different strategy to defend what we have constructed so far that took many lives in many countries, like to construct this basic form of democracy, and that we are losing it just like because coming some autocrats like Bukele or Andres Manuel, who are very, very highly popular, No, they have like high ratings of presidential approval, and they are still using the same discourse that democracy of before did not work. So they are already using and communicating a discourse to get supporters, and we are not yet in that moment. And then I think this is something that we need to work on.
Great, thank you. Fernando, is communication the issue?
I never think that's the case, and so I will say that. I will say I think to go back to your question,
Sure.
I think I do think that there is a degree to which the contemporary challenge to democracy in Latin America comes from the fact that they are not delivering, and they are not delivering on things that people care about particularly, which is crime. But also, we cannot forget that the past 10 years have been, in economic terms, kind of a lost decade to Latin America, right? Like after the end of the commodity boom, things got much harder, and it became much harder for governments to be able to manage the expectations of the public in ways that they were able to manage in the previous 10 years. And so, in some ways, I think there is a dimension of frustration with democracy that fuels the emergence of some of these leaders. I don't think it's the frustration with democracy that explains the entirety of the story, but I do think that it's part of it, right? The remaining part of the story, I think, and a lot also has to do with the emergence of these leaders. To some degree, it has to do with the changing international environment that lowered the barriers to democratic erosion in the region. The fact that the United States was constrained in recent years in its ability to promote democracy in Latin America because of the migration crisis. The fact that there was a role model effect of the election of Donald Trump, right? Like everywhere, people were inspired by it. And then the success of Bukele also had a similar role model effect. So there are domestic processes, but there are these role model effects from international success cases that have fueled the emergence of these leaders everywhere in the region. And lastly, and here I am really, I think I'm a bit worried that because this is being recorded and it will be saved for posterity, they'll make this point. But I think there's something about a kind of a process of organizational spread that we don't understand very well as political scientists, in which conservative groups from the United States have helped organize challenges to democracy in Latin America. The other day, I learned that there was a CPAC conference in Asunción, Paraguay, which is just absolutely insane in many ways if you think about, but it was really a kind of, there is a concerted effort by groups of spreading ideologies and ways of organizing politics and organizations that have come from the United States into Latin America and helped to explain the emergence of Bolsonaro, for example. They were they were part of the election of Milei. And so there seems to be kind of like an international dimension to this too. And so the emergence, to answer your question, it's both lack of delivery, the emergence of these leaders, but the emergence of the leaders is not a function exclusively of the lack of delivery. There is like an international process that might also be explaining their emergence.
Okay, great. Thanks. Claudio, you have elections in your country a week from Sunday.
Yeah,
how do you see it? Has democracy failed to deliver and now there's a authoritarian temptation, or?
Well, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
But let me try to put your question in a comparative way.
Okay.
Uruguay and Chile. Uruguay is the top one in terms of human development, and Chile is top two. Yeah, and they are very similar in terms of like small societies, very enduring institutionalization. And you have in Chile a paradox. You have an amazing well-being from 50% of people living under poverty in 1990 to 10% today, or 14%, depending on the way you measure. So you have a better living conditions in Chile than 30 years ago. In 2 generations, you have enormous shift. But in Uruguay, you don't have as much as discontent as in Chile. So the paradox in Chile is well-being with discontent. Why? So one response is the lack of delivery. Yes, to some extent, yes, you can see this in housing maybe, reproductive health, for instance, the health sector, maybe crime, yeah? But you have another aspect that you were mentioning, which is who is challenging the demands, the social demands, which is very relevant to understand why people are discontent. Like if you don't have actors that challenge your demands, you are in trouble. And what happened in Chile, as in comparison to Uruguay, is the total fragmentation and disruption of the links, the vertical links of political parties from the 1990 to the 2000s. Particularly the lefty party or the more progressive parties, and the actual emergency of a very well organization, and Juan Pablo Luna have studied this, of conservative parties. I mean, the fastest growth in political parties is the UDI, which is the former party of José Antonio Cast, probably the most likely president in Chile in 2 months. So you have a very efficient conservative party that make links with the popular sectors, and the lack of these links between the left parties and the popular sector. So basically, the Communist Party, the Socialist parties lost the popular support and start getting the middle and upper middle class support. So I think that one key issue is the how you challenge. I mean, you channel the social demands, and I think that this is some countries are lacking. Argentina probably is the same case with the Peronistas. Thank you.
Great, thanks. David, what are your thoughts on that question of, is it lack of delivery and performance that's fueling this, or?
I think we know surprisingly little about the causes, right, of this phenomenon in a way that is
That's why we
disturbing.
invited you.
Yeah, I'm not going to help. Sorry. I mean, I feel like if it was delivery mainly, you would see very different outcomes across different places. Some places, democracy is clearly delivered better than others, and that's certainly true regionally in Latin America. But you see these tendencies across a wide range of places, right? Including, I think a lot about Colombia, where I would argue, a democratic regime has delivered pretty well overall over the since the '91 Constitution was adopted. But people are still deeply dissatisfied. And I think democracy is still in deep trouble. The 1991 Constitution may be in big trouble, despite, I think, being very successful along a number of dimensions, which suggests to me that it may be something else. I don't know what the something else is exactly. These kind of organizational or spreading effects seem fundamental. But I don't know. I mean, I will say more broadly, maybe the model of liberal democratic constitutionalism is I think in big trouble, right? In the sense that the perception at least is maybe that it's not working or functioning as well as it should be. I mean, I think a lot about constitutions have changed a lot, and that's what I look at, really, constitutions, and they've changed a lot in recent years. They have more and more rights in them of more and more different types, right? So you have pretty much every constitution in Latin America now has socioeconomic rights, but you also have environmental rights, and you have a bunch of even newer rights that are kind of hard to categorize. Rights to sort of digital access and things are starting to show up. And I think that's indicative of, the Chilean process in 2022. The Constitution had well more than 100 rights articles in it. And that suggests to me there's a kind of popular demand for that sort of constitutionalism. How are you going to deliver that as a liberal democratic system, right? It's very, very difficult. I don't think just focusing on social rights. At one point we said, well, courts can't enforce these. We don't know what to do with them. That's not true, actually. Courts throughout Latin America do enforce socioeconomic rights. but what do they then do, right? What is achieved? And where are sort of the expectations of what you're going to do? And I don't know exactly what this means, but I think you load up constitutions with more and more promises, and there's no way you're going to be able to keep the bulk of those promises over a short period of time. And I think that, I don't know if that's a symptom or a cause, right? But that does suggest a kind of disenchantment where it's kind of like, how would we possibly make the model work, right? How would we possibly carry all that stuff out?
Isn't just a quick follow-up? Isn't there a backlash to that though? Of sort of I mean, they're going to have I mean, Noboa in Ecuador wants to do a new constitution, you know, to overturn the Korea constitution. And, you know, I would expect that there would be kind of a reduction of the rights that are in the current constitution. That's what he's pursuing. And, you know, Jose Antonio Cast wants to do a new constitution, probably. No, he's happy with the Pinochet constitution. Yeah, okay. So he doesn't want to change the constitution. Okay. See what? Right, he was drafted. But I mean, is there a backlash to saying, you know, well, let's forget about all these rights. Let's, you know, this is, first of all, like you said, how do you really, enforce them, and how do you really pursue them? But also, you know, this is a part of the project, right? To kind of that we've gone too far the other direction. So let's swing back, or no?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, let's see what comes out. Ecuador, of course, rewrites its constitution a lot, right? And I don't know. I mean, Correa saw his project, which was authoritarian, I think, essentially as consistent with a very guarantorist constitution in a way that's interesting. Noboa may not, right? It may be a kind of different kind of politics, and that's interesting. But I do think, you know, at the very least, the right stuff is not proven to be much of a barrier to authoritarianism in the region. And maybe you can go farther and say, like, the rights content is really important, but we got to figure out more effectively how to enforce it. And I don't think we have those answers. Some of those must be in institutional design of various sorts, but things that I really don't think we've even scratched the surface of at this point.
Okay, great. Well, we don't want to leave everybody, you know, clinically depressed. So let's, no, this is fine. But so I want to do another question and really ask all of our distinguished panelists to think about kind of more positive examples of kind of, you know, resisting backsliding, and whether through kind of judicial mechanisms or other mechanisms, and kind of maybe point to some examples where we've seen, you know, this process either slowed down or maybe even reversed. And, you know, Brazil might be an example, or other examples. But so you want to start? And, you know, I'm forcing you to be positive, so it may take you a while to, I'll give you extra time to think about it.
My positive comment. No, I'm really happy with these questions, because in most seminars I have participated, it's depressing all the time talking about the reforms we are seeing. But there are cases, successful cases of resilience. And I think, for instance, Poland, it's one of them. Poland has for the first time in more than almost 15, 20 years, get to elect someone else that is leading more democratic than before. So this is important because social mobilization was possible there. And I think this is some of the most important things when you need to be resilient. You need to have the support of civil society in order to defend what it is democratic. And that was a hard work for Polish people, I believe, because it was not really easy to fight, or also how the autocrats or these leaders that with really few democratic credentials were like putting all the democratic institutions before the people, were discrediting these institutions. And still, though, the Polish people was able to take out that government. I believe also Brazil is another important case of resilience, and in institutions, and I will focus more not only in civil society, but also in the part of institutions. I think the Supreme Court and the Electoral Court in Brazil have shown strong commitment with democratic principles. And this is very important. And not many courts do so, because courts in Latin America or in continental countries are very tied to the law. So they are not seeing themselves as political actors. And in these special cases where democratic backsliding or authoritarian moves are in the scene, judges need to take a different political stance, because there are not normal cases they are fighting for. I mean, I'm not claiming, as before, as I was like telling you, I'm not claiming that judges must be activists or political actors all the times, but there are cases in which they have to be in order to defend the democracy and rights and their own existence, because this is what is at stake. So I think these two cases, and also the Colombian case regarding the Constitutional Court when the court stopped Uribe for re-electing, are important cases that we can follow. And also see what society reaction was in that moment, what civil society did, what the academy did, what the media did, in order to protect that institution that was taking a bold decision against a potential autocrat.
Yeah, I have a quick anecdote about that, and I'm going to ask Fernanda, which is that when that decision was made, 2010, that Uribe couldn't go for a third term, the Obama administration, which was in power then, congratulated Uribe for respecting the decision. And I got all these emails from Colombian friends saying to me, why is he congratulating us? I mean, what else is he going to do? The Constitutional Court made its decision, and of course he's going to follow it. So why the congratulations? I thought it was very bizarre that the United States was kind of congratulating for something that was kind of normal and very much part of the political culture. Whatever one thinks about Uribe, and we could have a separate discussion about him, but the Constitutional Court decided, there was no question. He went along with it right away. So.
Yeah, okay. There. But this is really important, because, for instance, when politicians in Mexico are starting to disobey rulings in this past year, nobody say anything. And everyone's like, okay, this is in the power of the executive, not wanting to obey the ruling. And for instance, that was one of the reasons why the Judiciary Committee that must send their candidates to be in the election, they didn't send anything. All candidates were sent only by the legislative and the executive, which are dominated by the ruling party.
Great. Fernando, I'd love to get your thoughts about what Azul's point about sort of the judiciary being more political in some ways, if you could put it that terms. And is that, how do you see that in Brazil?
I think there was definitely part of it, and it was a conscious decision by Brazilian Supreme Court justices to do so. So when our friend Steve Levitsky was in Brazil recently, he had this conversation with Alexandre de Moraes, which is the leading judge against Bolsonaro. And during the conversation, it came to this point in which Alexandre de Moraes looked at him and said, well, we realized that we could be Churchill or Chamberlain, and we did not want to be Chamberlain. And so it was a conscious decision by the courts to come out and protect democracy. And they did it very much the way Azul described, in trying to find ways to respond to what they perceived as a crisis of democracy, and therefore finding ways of crisis response ways, right? They were not the kind of standard ways of doing things, and they have received a lot of heat about that. You read the New York Times talking about Alexandre de Moraes, they would say, oh, there's good things, there are bad things about it. That is true, and there are normative questions about it, but their perspective is that this was a crisis, had to be responded as a crisis. When the president is inviting all the ambassadors to a room, all the ambassadors to Brazil, and saying, the electoral system is rigged. The election, that if I lose, is going to be rigged. The electoral system can't just play nice. It needs to respond in a way that is like, when the president's trying to destroy democracy, this is not normal politics. This is not a fever. This is a cancer, and it needs to be done. It needs to be dealt with in some kind of hard way. It might be true, it might be false, that was necessary. That was not the point I'm trying to make. That's how they saw it. And I think in seeing it this way, they organized their response to it in that way. And the challenge now is how do you kind of rein back and bring it back from the crisis mode, right? Like in biology, there's this idea of allostasis and homeostasis, right? Like homeostasis is how the body deals with like regular stuff, and like a fever to like, or like you sweat when the temperature goes up, and that's like homeostasis. But there are times in which you're like, there's a strange body inside your body, and your body responds to it in an allostatic way. And that was kind of what they were trying to do, right? They realized it was a crisis and dealt with it as a crisis. And I think it was a successful case of dealing with the crisis.
And are you confident that they'll sort of go back to the normal mode, or is this?
No, I am not confident.
Okay.
I am not confident, and I'm not confident because I think it is really hard to exercise auto-contention, and it's even harder to push it back. And this emerged in a context of kind of crisis. It also emerged in a context of political vacuum in which Congress told them, you have to deal with this. We won't fight this. This is a fight that we couldn't fight. And they had to deal with it. And now to rein it over and bring them back, I just don't think there is the space and the political will and capacity to actually do. I think the near future, the Brazilian Supreme Court will remain as an absolutely central political actor in the country, and it has remained, right? Like right now, it is the critical part of the Lula coalition. In many ways, it has been in lockstep with the government in things that the government has wanted to pass, like even like a tax reform and etc. And the Supreme Court has been part of the government coalition in ways that might not be great, but for the purpose of protecting the democracy, did work.
And what's the, if I could just, what's the public perception of the Supreme Court in Brazil?
So
what is the polling?
So it is highly polarized depending on your attitude towards Bolsonaro. And so those who tend to support Bolsonaro see the court as biased and essentially politicized. Lula supporters tend to have grown much more fond of the courts. They were not, and now they've grown much more fond of the courts. And so society is very divided on this.
50-50.
It is not 50-50 because there is kind of a lingering distrust of institutions in general. But it is certainly now that there is like a polarization in which if you are on one side, you are more sympathetic. If you're on the other side, you're less sympathetic, even though the kind of baseline is not, no one thinks that the courts are great, right? Like, it's just like, they are better or worse than we expected them to actually be. That seems to be the division.
Great, thanks. Claudio, going back to the issue of sort of resisting or slowing down backsliding, and your analysis shows that there are grounds to be concerned about where things may be headed in Chile. And so I'm just curious to know how you see some potential kind of reactions to that, to try to limit that.
Yeah, I will put the optimist part as you
Good.
you told me.
We count on the Chileans to be optimistic.
Okay.
We used to.
No, I think that, I mean, on the positive side, I think that institutions are still responsive, and I will talk about Chile, still responsive to risk of backsliding or the erosion of democracy, and I will give you few examples. One, the response on the 2019 crisis, that it was a political response toward like looking for a political solution to a social crisis. And I think that is a symptom that the political parties actually are still able to, in critical moments, to respond to this type of crisis. The judiciary, for instance, facing a huge crisis in the health system, particularly discrimination against women in the private health system. It was the Supreme Court that ruled about providing equal access to women for health. And that was huge in terms of money because affected the business, and in terms of like the respect of basic rules. And And I think that the Contraloría General de la República, which is the auditing institution, I think you don't have here in the US, or do you have like a Contraloría? It's like an auditing institution. Is very strong and an autonomous institution. Right now, is playing a huge role in terms of like controlling corruption and checking out relevant aspect of the armed forces, the police, the administration of the state administration. So I think that institutions are still responsive. The second aspect is the civil society. I think that in a event that you might have a right-wing government, probably civil society will play a relevant role. Particularly organized women movements have been probably the most relevant movement in the last 10 years. And finally, building international coalitions. We are very sensitive to what people talk about Chile abroad, and building that kind of coalitions are essential to cope with eventual like authoritarian tendency or trend. I mean, a letter, probably sometime a letter in the New York Times is much more relevant than a thousand of signatures in a letter in Chile. So because we are very aware, and Chile is very open to the world, and the new condition of the social network, etc., allows us to have a more strong impact in the local affairs from abroad. So the boomerang effect that Keck and Seeking was talking back in the 90s, I think is working it's very healthy in terms of like protecting certain human rights and also the democratic institutions.
Great, thanks. David, cheer us up, David.
I don't know if I can. I'm kind of on two minds on these cases where the courts are the protagonists, right? And they exist. I mean, I think Brazil is fascinating, right? In Colombia, which is the case I've studied pretty closely, is really very interesting. The court issues this landmark decision using pretty aggressive doctrine, right? A third term for a president would be an unconstitutional constitutional amendment. So not only can you kind of not do it, you can't even do it if you amend the Constitution, right? It's a strong ruling. Mila Versteeg and her co-authors did a comparative study. They looked at term limits of evasion all over the world in recent years, and they found that Colombia was the only case where a court had stepped in to kind of stop term limits of evasion, and find any others. And there are a lot that go the other direction in Latin America in recent years, a lot. There are a bunch of cases where the courts allow presidents to do dubious things and just say, hey, that's fine. You can get rid of your term limit. There's no issue there. And there's others where they actually root out the term limit. They say the unconstitutional constitutional amendment is the term limit. Honduras, Bolivia, those are the most striking in the sense those weren't even amendments. Like they just invalidated part of their own constitution. Judicial doctrine, creative routings of the new constitutionalism are indeed very powerful. They can be used for all kinds of ends. And so I think that it's great if you have a strong court that's able to stand up for democracy. The worst thing pretty much you can have is a captured court that then becomes a really powerful tool against it. And there are more cases in the region recently of that, captured court, than there are of the strong independent court. Now, I don't know what implications you draw from that. One is you make it harder to capture. The design of the apex court is really important. And like the Colombian court, for example, is very well designed. And I think that made it harder. Uribe really could not have captured the court very effectively within his terms. But it's still possible. And if an actor has enough power, they can always amend the Constitution and do a bunch of things to make it easier. So I think that dispersal of power is actually key to a lot of the successful cases of resistance in different ways. And going back to the Polish case, I think one of the stories there, the Constitutional Court was an instrument of the regime, but the rest of the judiciary was not fully captured, and they played key roles. So thinking about the whole judiciary is one thing, and then having redundancy in independent institutions is helpful. That is one of the things that really worries me about the unitary executive theory that U.S. Supreme Court is deploying now is we actually have, as a statutory level in the U.S., a lot of independent enclaves, some of them highly capable. And the doctrine that says, no, you can kind of take all those over as the president is pernicious because it reduces the value of that redundancy. And if all you have is an apex court, that is really a gamble. Because I think more likely than not, when the chips are down, you are not going to have an institution that's going to be willing to stand up for democratic norms. You might, and you hope you do, but you may not.
Great.
Sorry, that didn't cheer anybody up.
No. I shouldn't have called on you. That was my mistake. I was counting on you. Anyway, these have been all great comments. I wanna, open it up if that's okay. Diana, is that okay? Yeah, because I think there are people here. I see them on the edge of their seats, wanting to ask. So, why don't we ask questions, and these brilliant analysts will respond. So, who wants to get started? Either a comment or a question. You don't have to disguise your comment as a question. You could just, you don't have to.
Thank you so
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Super interesting talk. And then I was just wondering, so I'm a student right now in SFS and I'm studying international political economy. And then since we're now having touch on a lot of economic factors, so economic factor impacting all these democratic trends, and then how does it impacting the government of all these countries? I was wondering, my question is not specific to anyone. I was wondering whether can all of you comment a little bit about how the economic factor or economic situation in your country impact the democratic and legal regression, if there's any.
Good. I think, Fernando, you referred to that a little bit about economic stagnation and
Right.
lost decade and all of that. Maybe
Right.
you could elaborate a little bit.
Yeah, so I think at least my understanding is that this has increased pressures in the region. It is not the fundamental cause of democratic backsliding. Latin America has had bad economic times for forever, right? Like the commodity boom is an exception, not the rule in the region. And so in that sense, bad economic times are not so reasonable here. But it did create challenges that compounded with the fact that you have a weak state all across the region, compounded with the fact that international pressures to keep democracy alive diminished, and etc., just made democracy more vulnerable, right? And so I think that the past last 10 years have been difficult for governments in general, in part because the economy has not helped. And that's part of the story. I think there are other parts of the story that have a more international component, right? Like the world is changing. The United States is no longer the sole relevant power in the world. And as the world becomes more multipolar and the United States chooses whether it remains as a global actor or it becomes a hemispheric hegemon, that will also shape the dynamics of democracy in the region in different ways, and how those things also affect Latin America in ways that I think they have impacted democracy in many ways. Another way in which this has mattered a lot is the pressure for migration, right, which were an important kind of indirect effect in democracy through U.S. Attitudes towards democracy in Latin America, or kind of desire to pressure. So economic crisis in Latin America increases the flux of migrants north, and then as the flux of migrants increase, the U.S. becomes less likely to try to pressure Latin American governments to protect democracy, because they fear that these governments may take advantage of the migration flows to then put pressure on the U.S. So it just creates more tension. So the economy is not helping, and it's not the sole cause of the crisis, but it is definitely one of the kind of sources of tension.
And if the economy starts booming again, you think that might help relieve some of the...
I think so.
Yeah,
I think it
would help.
it
wouldn't solve the problem, but
even that wouldn't be the entire story, but it will help, particularly if you, in context in which you do not have, in which you can avoid the emergence of this kind of anti-democratic actors, right? Because the commodity boom did help anti-democratic actors erode democracy when you kind of kind of gave them strong winds, right? And so, like Chavez was incentivized by the fact that he had sold all that oil money, but that came after he came to power, right? And so, if the commodity boom hits when you have a bit like one of the bad guys in power, that's really bad. when the commodity boom, if the good economic times hit when you have one of the good guys in power, that's actually pretty good. Which is, I think, a general argument about how the preferences of these leaders is shaping the outcomes of Latin America. Like lots of the effects of many of the things we have thought about are conditional. So there are places in which good economic times help. There are times in which they make things harder. There are places in which having a congressional majority, for example, if you are a kind of pro-democracy guy, you have a congressional majority, that's great. If you are actually trying to erode democracy, a congressional majority is terrible, right, for democracy. Good for you, but terrible for democracy. And so everything's conditional, and I think the effect of the economy is conditional on the nature of the guy in power.
Great, thanks. So you wanted to add something?
So there's something very short. Economic is a factor that matters, but I think that not only economic boom or stress, but especially economic inequality. I think economic inequality in our countries is really important because the problem is not if the economy in the macro level is doing well. The problem is that people perceive in the micro level that they are not equal, and they are not. And this is something that is pushing democracies like to both autocrats. And I think this is one of the main reasons we can find. I think this is the argument that just made Susan Stokes in her last book also.
Right, great. Claudio, did you want to add?
No, basically, following this, I think that we need to also look at the structure of the economy, whether it's a service economic realm, the temporal workers, the informality, the level of informality, for instance, is very high in Peru, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Chile. Personal debt is also a very key factor, whether you have access to credit and you are in debt. And then the other aspect is the dimension of the role of the state within the economy, which is very relevant in terms of like, is this state in a boom saving money or expending the money? All these questions are key to analyze the role of the economy in terms of like the democratic health, you know.
Great, thank you. Yes, sir, and then we'll go to...
Hello. Hi. Yeah. Thank you very much for this panel. Has been great. One comment and one question. The comment is like in 2010 in Colombia, President Uribe didn't want to follow the the rule of the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, but a lot of mistakes, political and legal mistakes were made, and after that was unsustainable to follow that third period.
No one wants to give up power. I'm not,
oh, yeah, exactly. But
that's,
my question is, what role do you think social media has right now in the misleading, disguiding, eroding of the democracy in Latin America? Because I completely hate, let me rephrase it, I don't like how
no, hate is fun here.
Yeah, thank
it's
you.
okay, it's okay.
I completely hate how my president, Gustavo Petro, ruled the country via tweets. And how you wake up one morning and you figure it out that now you have more rights or less rights, or you're in the middle of a fight with the United States or different countries because he chose to use social media as a weapon right now. And so,
well,
in your opinion, how social media, what role has in this process?
We don't have that here, so don't have to worry about it.
I know.
Who wants to take on social media? That's a good question. Go ahead.
Andrés Manuel López Obrador, when he won the election in 2018, he said, bless social media for this. No, benditas redes sociales. Why? Because this is a powerful weapon. This is a powerful weapon to govern, actually. That's why we were saying and stressing this morning, communication is really important. And communication not for the normal ways we used to do it, but especially in this media, because otherwise we are, as one of my colleagues in El Salvador put it, we are lost. I don't want funding for research projects. I want funding to put my evidence at the same level as Bukele can put her tweets and convince all the people in seconds, right? And this is really important because otherwise we are not at the level of convincing other people of what they are doing wrong and how they are manipulating reality. And I think this has a big impact in democracy because they trash talk institutions and still come out like Democrats, right?
Any other thoughts on social media? No? Okay. We'll go. Lorenzo, you want to please?
Thank you. I would like to go back to the relationship with between economy situation and democratic backsliding. And I agree with what Fernando just said, but I would like to underline an issue. In the bottom, the main problem, if you try to identify what's beside with the misconfirming, with the disconformation with democracy, at the end of the day, you always find inequality, as I just said. And I think it's caused for two main reasons. First one, in practically all the transitions into democracy in Latin America, that expectation of democratization of the system was also accomplished with an overload of expectations. Democratization is not only free and fair elections. We can choose whoever will govern us or represent us. It was also, in many ways, an expectation of better conditions of life. It's not me who's saying that. Dante Caputo, when wrote the UNDP report on the status of Latin America in 2002, we are talking in a moment in which, even in Venezuela, democratic backsliding was still, a menace, but not an accomplished issue. Dante Caputo wrote that all democracies in Latin America are playing a suicidal game. They're testing how much poverty can a democracy hold. And there are a lot of papers and books written on this issue. But at the end of the day, this disconformity with democracy is something that is being used and abused by autocrats and populist solutions, promising, easy solutions, easy or fast ways to change, the social reality. And I think, it's a discussion with a lot of friends. Even my dear Alejandro Werner will not talk about my future boss here in Georgetown. Not at all. No, but it's a discussion. There was an underestimation of what inequality can produce. And that's why, and the best proof, I agree with you, if you have a good economical situation, Fernando, everything is easier. If you don't have it, everything is worse or more difficult. But if you look back, not even in the moments of huge economic growth. I'm thinking in Mexico with the oil prices boom in the earliest 2000. The problem of inequality wasn't solved. And I think that's something we have to rethink, especially because it's very often to hear, oh, wow, for instance, in Mexico and other countries, oh, well, we were better before, this populist solution came on. And as Nadia Urbinati warning us, in Mille People, the worst thing you can desire is get back to the moment in which everything was served, so the populist solutions get the power. We have to rethink that issue. In Latin America, it's very important, and I don't want to extend myself, but I just want to mention this. Look at Latino Barometro indications. Everybody is a Democrat, and the appreciation for democracy grows up, as well as the people who will accept a military government, an authoritarian government, that solves its daily necessities, you know. So it's a very, and that brings me to the communication issue. I mean, all the populists in Latin America, all the authoritarian governments in Latin America fulfill their mouths with democracy and the democratic discourse is the people who wants this. I'm achieving the people's desires, and watch how the results in the last elections to prove that. And that's my point. There is also, it's not the same inequality that having not democracy. That's why early this morning I was saying it's very important to distinguish the concept of democracy and the conditions on democracy. But they are not divorced. At the end of the day, the wellness of a democracy depends on the conditions of democracy. And so inequality and economics are, at the end of the day, in the root of the problem, according to me.
That's great. Thank you.
Can I say one thing about inequality?
yeah,
Yeah, I didn't want to say that I disagree that social media is an important thing, because I didn't want to be contrarian, but you're teasing me with the inequality thing, so I'll be contrary on that point. I think inequality is obviously important, but inequality is also a constant in Latin America. Like, Latin America today is, in fact, less unequal than it was when the country was democratized. Like, the third wave of democracy happened, and Latin America was more unequal then than it is today. The commodity boom actually brought erosion, decreasing inequality everywhere. In fact, it's fascinating. One fascinating thing that I don't think we understand well in Latin America. All around the world since the 1980s, it has been extremely hard to have what in some other word called inclusive economic growth, which is economic growth that rises every boat, right? That is really across the economic spectrum. The very few regional level exception was Latin America under the commodity boom. It was one of the few instances of inclusive economic growth in the world since the 1980s, in which you saw economic growth, not like you've seen in the United States in the past 40 years, which is essentially economic growth at the top 10% of the income distribution. It was something that was much more spread. And so I'm skeptical that inequality explains the timing of this. Inequality is a constant problem in Latin America. Populists in the 1930s were mobilizing inequality as a way of dealing with and eroding democracy. And so that, I think, is obviously true, but the degree to which that explains the contemporary wave of autocratization, then I'm less skeptical. Again, Chile is an extremely unequal case. It had a very well-functioning democracy for a long time. Latin America was more unequal 40 years ago, and that was the time in which it was democratizing. So I'm just not, I just don't, I think inequality is a constant. It's not really a variable. And so the way to which it shapes things is as a constant. Like, it's the fact, it's kind of hard to pinpoint this way.
It's a good thing to rely on something that's, predictable, right? Inequality. Did you have a question here? Yeah. Yes. Did you? Yeah. I thought you did. No?
Oh, I do.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
I just have a comment on the inequality and on a question. On the inequality, I think that the United States is resembling more Latin America and becoming more unequal, and inequality has not been a constant. Perhaps it's been growing, and that's why the US se está latinoamericanizando.
Convergence.
Yeah.
Convergence.
So I mean, I would be, it's a case of like worth reflecting in that inequality is rising, and in some places it's not a constant, but actually a variable to look at.
Yes, but the US case in terms of rising inequality is quite unique. The rest of, not quite unique, but it's really a kind of Anglo-Saxon story of inequality.
Okay.
The rest of the world haven't experienced the same kind of explosion of top 10% inequality you've seen in the United States, and that was definitely not the case in Latin America.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other question is about academic freedom, and because I think academics have the curse and the benefit of looking at things from looking at sort of things that can happen, but don't have sometimes the voice, the level. And I'm sure there are ways in which academic freedom in Mexico, in Chile, even here in the US, is being thwarted. So are you seeing that? And what are you, I mean, from less from an academic, but more from a public intellectual perspective. What are the tools that are being used for that? And especially because there's an ideological double standard, and it's really important to have academics that know how to say, leftists can be autocrats, and so can people in the right wing. And but people don't like those people too much.
Okay.
So what are you doing about that? Thanks.
Okay. Did you want to talk about academics and maybe in Mexico, I don't know, or anywhere else that you think it's relevant?
Yeah, it is. And I think we're not doing enough here because we are seeing how they are harassing the courts, how they are harassing institutions. But then another very uncomfortable institution for this will be autocrats are universities. Right, that's the one of the targets of Orban, for instance, in Hungary with the Central European University that just moved to Vienna and closed everything there, but also in Benghazi in Turkey, and also the CIDE in Mexico. Right, they are prosecuted basically in Mexico. We have even formally prosecuted scholars for doing their job. So this is something that we need to understand more in a collective way. I think as universities by themselves can do anything, but maybe several associations, different types of association into which we belong, they must mobilize in order to create guidelines for how to react to this type of attacks that are coming from in budget matters. No, I just heard, for instance, my colleague from Arizona, her university is had several cuts. I believe in other universities in the US is the same. The city was totally destroyed in Mexico. There is no one there. We just last 2 weeks, the colleagues presented a paper on populism, the relation between populism and academic freedom, attacks on academic freedoms. And there you find, for instance, this type of attacks, being 21 faculty members, they are now 8 faculty members. Nobody criticized the government there anymore, only these people. And this is something that we have to worry about, not leaving alone the universities, which are targeted by attacks.
Yeah, you want to say, David?
Yeah, I think in some ways, the problem is, well, one sees, I think, across a number of different countries, including the U.S., is the universities in many, many ways are easy targets, right, for populists, I think, from a bunch of different standpoints. First of all, there's a bunch of different discourses you can use, right? I think some of which are more fiscal and others of which are more kind of cultural. And they both work pretty well. Another, is just, frankly, lack of popularity understanding of a lot of universities, or a lot of what professors do, which I think means that the attacks resonate pretty heavily with populists. It's pretty easy to caricature professors often as kind of elites. And so just from a discursive perspective, they're pretty effective attacks. And then it's easy to play a kind of divide and conquer strategy, right? I think as you're referring to is it's easy to turn into kind of every actor, every university for themselves. And the other point I will raise just is, I don't think the concept of academic freedom is particularly well defined or understood, even academically, right? It's kind of ironic. And so I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done about that. What is it? What is academic freedom? Why is it truly crucial? What are the limits of it? All of those questions we all have intuitive answers to these, right? But I think that stuff is not as resonant. In the US, it often gets put into other boxes, oh, it's a freedom of speech issue. Well, yeah, but not exactly, right? It's distinct. And, in part, obviously, in the US, unlike some other constitutions, it doesn't have an explicit constitutional foundation, right? There's no academic freedom article or anything like that. But I do think there's a lot of just even academic work maybe to be done in the communication work. Because right now, I think it's a bad spot, right? I think because of these factors I've identified.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Claudio, please.
I will go back to the question of inequality that you and Lorenzo raised, because I think that one way to tackle this, I mean, I think it's relevant inequality itself, but one way to go in this question is to ask what is producing inequality. And what it produces inequality is the perception of an unfair treatment, and that people have different access, or you have access and you don't have access to certain goods. So it's not inequality itself, but is what is producing. Probably is trying to connect these two things. In Chile, we start asking about this, and people were not upset about perceiving that certain people are rich and certain people are poor. The question was not about the richness of these people. The question was about how I am being treated, and I want to be treated equally in the public system. I want to have access to a good health as the rich are having. So it was not against the privileges. It was about me having an fairness, basically. So inequality produced the perception of injustice, I think. So I think that in this way, I think that it would be more interesting to address the issue. The second question that I want to address is the social media issue. So I was wondering, but I don't have the response, about why populists or certain far right-wing parties are so effective in social media, and why this is not happening with the progressive parties. So I think that we need to respond to that, because in the last 5 years, we have been saying, or at least in Chile and in other European countries that have been talking about this issue of, so the populists they are so good using social media. So the question is, why other sectors are not using it so effectively? So what is going on with that? Is the simplicity of the message? What is going on there? I think that we need to respond to that, because otherwise, I think that the social media is not that it's negative or positive. I think it's there. So the question is why certain actors use it and why other actors are not using it. And in the same way, the question of framing. People say, hey, the populists frame these issues so well. So yeah, but framing, the question is why the progressive are not framing so well certain things. Why for us, I consider myself a progressive person, why for us it's so difficult to let the message in a very clear way to the public. So the question is, I think, and is related to public intellectual in Chile. We have huge issues about this because intellectuals are perceived as an elite in a bubble and that are not connected to reality. And our messages are very, very, very complicated. I mean, very complicated. So I think we need to work about the issues of communication, as you were saying. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Alejandro, you have the right to rebuttal.
Oh, no, but
You've been mentioned, so.
I didn't even understand the criticism, so
Okay,
we'll
good,
talk afterward. But
okay.
that's fine.
Okay.
No, but I think I was wanted to jump in. I totally agree that, I mean, in the transition to democracy, explicitly or implicitly, we oversold the benefits of democracy, or the hopes of the people of what democracy was going to bring were very, very high. And then
And then I think even governments thought that their policies were going to provide so much growth that even if we didn't improve on issues of the perception of inequality, of fairness, of outcomes, fairness of access, etc., growth per se, for a while was going to compensate for these things because everybody was going to be doing better. And we were completely mistaken on that. And I think your issue, I mean, even if income inequality improved because of the commodity boom, wages, etc., but on top of that, through public programs and minimum wage increases, whatever, at the end of the day, the perceptions of discrimination on many dimensions, gender, racial, etc., in many of our countries, in a democratic system with people even doing slightly better, became more important for them than 20 years before. So I think, I mean, this is a very complex phenomenon, but I think it goes, López Obrador almost won 12 years before he won. So timing López Obrador access to power, it's a little bit futile because he could have been president 12 years ago. And he became president now, but eventually, I mean, the only thing that would have, I think statistically was bound to happen in the next quarter century that he was going to be president, no? And the last thing I want to say, I think there's a problem with social media in the sense that it is a tool, but it seems that given that the target commercially, social media algorithms try to maintain people online and hook hate messages and polarization messages are spread more widely than more sensible messages, and therefore pro-democracy candidates and politicians are less able to exploit it. No, that's a little bit my 2 cents.
Great, thanks. As prerogative of the chair, sorry, because we're gonna have to close, but I did want to ask a final question, and want to get any thoughts from any of the panelists or all of the panelists. When one talks about democratic backsliding in the region, the example that really stands out, I think, is Bukele, and it's taken to an extreme point. You know, the most popular leader in the region, and a reference and a model. I think you talked about this, Fernando. Many other countries, you know, wherever you go, it's Bukele. And what I'd like to ask the panelists is if, not to predict, because we don't make predictions, but, you know, what are you going to look for in terms of, 10 years from now? Will we see a Bukele still in office with 80% support? Will we see a Bukele in office with 30% support, but using other means to kind of exercise control over the population? Will we see more the emergence and space and opening of democratic forces that can provide some resistance? I mean, just what's the theory of change? How will change happen, or won't it happen, or what do you see? I mean, will it be because of the social issues, unemployment, the lack of growth? Will it be overreaching on some of the sort of human rights issues? Or are we going to see a enormously popular, president? Talking about social media, no one's more expert than that. So just any reflections at all about where this might be going and what we should be looking for? Yes.
I would argue probably the issue for the foreseeable future is more like a kind of instability, I think, right? I mean, it seems to me that, so I don't know, a lot of the steps towards authoritarianism that I think we see in the region, the US, wherever, I think a lot of those they're clearly reflections of discontent with democracy, right? And with liberal democratic constitutionalism. But I don't think it's that easy to instantiate alternatives. And I think in a lot of, I don't know about El Salvador particularly, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to see the trajectory, but it seems to me that I think we're going to see a lot of is incumbents actually having a hard time consolidating power in a number of countries. And maybe that, that may be specific to certain regions. The Andes, a classic example, I think, where you're seeing that dynamic now. But in general, I think it's hard to figure out how to govern right now, and I don't think you're going to see any clear alternative model. I think it's be Bukeleism or whatever you want to call it in the near future. I could be wrong, but just sort of a generalized instability in Latin America, and I think more broadly, maybe in big parts of the world.
Any thoughts? Yeah. So, what do you think?
Yeah, it is a question that leads us to close in a negative and sad way.
I don't want to do that.
So, because what I see is that we are entering a political change phase, a transition to non-democratic regimes, as different to the 90s. What I see with these old backsliding processes in different parts of the world is that some of them can be resisted, but others are successful, and they tend to stay 10, 20 years, maybe more, in power. And then it is difficult to go back, no? If you see the case of Poland now, it has been very difficult for them to recover, for instance, judicial independence. And don't talk about judicial independence. To fight the judges that are sitting now in the courts and are becoming a wall to the elected government, to the democratic elected government. So you have like authoritarian shoes and pick-up judges that are making problems to the democratic elected government. So this is something that is really difficult to overcome. So I don't see that we are like, if we go back to the 20th century, we see that we have this wave of democratization, autocratization in the 70s, democratizations in the 90s. Now we're entering a wave of autocratization again, right? And we need to understand how things can be changed and what we did before, because we have done it before. Now we have experience. As before, Mexico didn't have any experience. Now we do have experience, how to construct and build up democratic institutions. So I think we can hang on that experience in order to push a change in institutions that have been already destroyed.
Great, thanks. You have any thoughts, Fernando?
Well, I think on the El Salvador case in particular, it's also not a case I know well. What I think we should think about is that institutionalizing authoritarian rule is hard. Very few autocrats actually succeed at it. And so the odds are against everyone who tries. Bukele has a strong hand, right? Like, he's very popular. He was able to deal with a very salient problem, which was the violence and particularly the extortion issue. And he was able to also eliminate a lot of the kind of sources of power of opposition. And so he has done very well so far. But at the same time, surviving 50 years, doing what the PRI did and surviving power is 80 years, only the PRI did in Latin American history, right? Like, it is an extremely hard thing to do. And institutionalizing it in this kind of personalistic fashion is even harder, right? Usually authoritarian regimes that institutionalize are post-revolutionary regimes that erode, that kind of kill the military, that create a new kind of party-based kind of authoritarianism, which is not what Bukele is doing. And so I won't say I'm optimistic. I just think that history tells us that this is a tricky a thing to pull. And so maybe we will be, maybe 10 years from today, he will have failed as the majority of them. I just don't know what the odds of survival versus majority. I just think it's a hard thing to say. For the region in general, I agree that this is not a good moment in general for democracy. And I think going back to a point I've already made in this conversation, I do think that the international environment has changed in very important ways. This is not the age of democracy anymore. In the United States will not be unambiguously an agent of democratization or democratic survival in the region anymore. It might actually become an agent of autocratization, and it could be that in different parts of the region. It will interfere in elections in all different ways. It's kind of trying to shape outcomes in Argentina. I cannot like the Brazilian right tried to get Trump to intervene in favor of Bolsonaro. I bet he's going to try to do something about the Colombian elections, and so he, meaning Trump, obviously, will try to do something about the Colombian elections. And so I think this is not a good time for democracy. But at the same time, I do think that there are several cases of success in the region. Ecuador, after the end of Correa, was a case of kind of recovery. Argentina was able to fend off the kind of challenges in the 1990s. In 2001, Argentina had an economic collapse that, like, it was unprecedented. It was just unbelievable, and the democracy survived. Brazil has survived. Chile was able to clean the authoritarian trash. Is in deep trouble, but succeeded for 40 years. And so there are a bunch of success cases in the region, and we are not condemned to being authoritarian forever. We have found ways, and so maybe.
Wonderful note to end on, Fernando. Thank you for that. Sorry, Claudia, did you want to say something? Not pessimistic though, right? We don't want to bring people down. Go ahead. No, we're counting on you to be optimistic. Sorry. No, go ahead.
10 years from now, I see three big forces that are affecting society. First, technological changes. They are huge and affecting labor force enormously, and already is changing the structure of the economy. Second, climate change is also a force, like is drying, for instance, Chile. We are in the north without water. So it's forcing the movement of people, etc. And the expansion of access to drugs, which is a third main force that is impacting in society. So I think I agree with you with David, the prospect is more instability, probably formal democracy with thin democracies with authoritarian rules within it, in order to control social protest and social discontent. Probably that I would say it would be 10 years from now, but 10 years from now I will be retired. So,
but this is all on tape, Claudio. So we're going to play all this back to you in 10 years. So you're on the record here. So anyway, this has been a terrific and fascinating panel, and 4 really outstanding analysts and speakers. And thank you all for your great questions, and thank Diana and Denise and Kate and everybody else, and for joining us. And please join me in thanking these terrific speakers.
Thank you.